The horror of the Whitlock clan. The mystery behind 472 missing children. Virginia, 1842. When the wind still knew how to claw at tree bark with ice-cold fingernails and the earth still cracked open to bleed, Harrington Manor had risen from the heart of Dogwood Parish like a wound that never healed. Perched precariously on a desolate hill, a place no map depicted, where the grass was scorched dry from the roots and the wind never changed direction, the mansion existed as an unacknowledged sacrament, a place that even prayer could not reach. It was tall, narrow, leaning eastward, as if listening to whispers from deep within the earth. Its windows were always dark, even in the middle of a June afternoon, and in the central hall hung a mirror, its glass as murky as smoke-infused mercury, rumored not to reflect the present, but to hold on to things that had once lived and still breathed. No one spoke its name directly. The townspeople only whispered, "The Whitlock house." The family once consisted of 5 people, a proper insular and quiet family, until the night of the storm in 1824, when Mr. and Mrs. Whitlock vanished. No bodies were ever found, only a portrait torn in two, the cut running from the top of the head straight down to the heart. After that night, the 3 daughters, Eleanor, Cordelia, and Maeve, lived alone in the mansion and were never seen apart. Eleanor Cordelia and Maeve Whitlock, always dressed in long black silk gowns that swept the floor, their collars buttoned high above the chin, they moved together like a 3-headed specter, always carrying vials of an herbal solution that smelled strongly of tree sap or pieces of cloth shimmering with reddish-brown oil stains. And when a woman in the region went into labor or bled for too long after childbirth, people did not call for a doctor. They waited for a shadow. One of the 3 sisters would appear barefoot, soundless, crossing the frigid fields, a long linen bag in hand filled with strange instruments, among which something glinted under the moonlight like a needle made of bone. They never knocked. They just appeared. And once inside, they did not leave until life or something else had been transferred. Some whispered that they mumbled incantations in a language not recorded in any scripture, more ancient than the stone foundation of the mansion itself. Others said they never opened their mouths at all. Only a faint hissing sound could be heard, like a needle-piercing skin coming from within the walls. Before we go any further, let us know where you're watching from and what time it is there. Leave it in the comments below. The first record of the Whitlock women did not appear in any census or baptismal register. The Whitlock women did not exist on paper, only in the shadows of mirrors and in decay. The first trace was discovered not by a priest or a witness, but in a rotting burial ledger hidden in a rusty tin box nailed beneath a shadowless cross behind the Harrington Chapel. The ledger contained nothing but the names of the dead and their causes: Eliza uterine rupture, Charity breech birth, Ruth blood loss, and under each name was a line of symbols that looked like an unfinished stitch: EWCWMW. The letters were identical to those carved on the inner side of the mirror in the mansion, the thing Eleanor Whitlock once called the eye of the needle to the other world. People began to understand wherever they laid their hands that place did not just die, it was held back. No one saw blood spilt. There were no screams. Only souls that had not yet left their bodies, sewn back by something invisible. And somewhere in the mansion, when night fell, the mirror would cover itself in a thin layer of mist, as if breathing on behalf of another. By the spring of 1843, the mirror began to breathe more heavily. Not with the sound of wind, but with a cold vapor that condensed on the glass every midnight, as if something inside was trying to squeeze its way out. From Harrington Manor, a distortion began to leak, spreading into the surrounding households, not souls coming out, but a copy of their own fear being drawn in. At the old stone well in the town center, mothers began to whisper of misaligned phenomena. Agnes Bell said her daughter, born during the miasma season, could not sleep unless she was placed within a circle of salt, arranged in the shape of a teardrop around her cradle, as if to block someone's gaze from the other side of the mirror. Martha Ellison claimed her daughter wept blood when the evening light struck her makeup mirror, until Cordelia Whitlock sent over a dark reed, instructing it to be hidden under the pillow to distort the reflection. But the most terrifying story was that of Rebecca Alcott, the pastor's wife. She lost 2 sons in 1 week, and then at a dawn the color of ash, she saw Maeve Whitlock standing at the edge of her garden, her gaze fixed on Harrington Manor. Maeve dug a shallow hole and buried a lock of hair wrapped around a small cracked piece of mirror, then sprinkled it with salt and black candle ash. When Rebecca asked what it was, Maeve only smiled, looked down at the dry well and said, "The reflections of trapped souls will gnaw on everything if their mouths are not sewn shut." A week later, Rebecca left town, leaving behind a baby boy with no shadow and one final whisper. "It doesn't know God's name, but it whispers my own name correctly from behind the mirror." The bells of Whitlock Hollows Church stopped ringing in the summer of 1843. Not from rust, not from a storm, but because the bell rope had been severed cleanly. The cut is straight and smooth as if made by a scalpel, leaving no saw marks. No one saw it happen, but everyone whispered their eyes, glancing towards Harrington Manor, where a light still flickered through the dust-caked glass, especially from the northern mirror room, which no one had been allowed to enter since Eleanor's time. The Whitlock family never appeared at holy services. No kneeling, no sign of the cross, no singing of hymns. They stood at the back motionless, as if listening to a different rhythm, a ritual that needed no church, only a reflection. Then came the ash fever, which swept through the town, an invisible fire burning from within. 12 people died in less than a week. And in the chaos, Cordelia Whitlock was the first to appear at every threshold carrying wooden bowls of steaming tree bark, her mouth whispering strange syllables as if pronounced from a throat reflected in a mirror. All who survived the fever told the same story. A sound echoed like a horse's hooves on cold stone ringing in their ears during their delirious fits. And then an ice-cold hand pressed down on their chest, holding tight, keeping something that was trying to emerge through their skin from within. The doctor called it mass hysteria. The priest called it a sign of the devil. But Cordelia only said, "When the body burns, the mirror cracks. And if we don't keep what is inside, it will find a way to reflect into another." Charivari. One night in early August, Levi Donnell, a 9-year-old boy, dared to do what the local children only spoke of. In daylight, he climbed onto the back porch of Harrington Manor, where the light from the mirror room never fully went out, only flickered like the eye of a blind person searching in their sleep. Dared by his older brother Levi was supposed to touch the black wooden door of the northern corridor, right where the mirror was kept under a red velvet cloth, and run back. But he didn't run, nor did he scream, nor did he return on time. When dusk fell and Levi Donnell had not come back, his older brother ran down the hill, his face drained of all color. He ran up to the porch, touched the mirror as promised. The boy said, "And then he was gone." His voice broke like a thin piece of glass. The adults trudged up to Harrington Manor carrying oil lamps and ropes, calling Levi's name over the cold iron-like steps. The door was not locked. The house was not dark. The 3 Whitlock sisters stood at the end of the corridor, their shadows leaning long in the light as if defying the angle of the lamps. Cordelia said, "No one came." Maeve said, "We did not open the door." They both looked down at the floor as if waiting for someone to step out from beneath the floorboards. "No one was let in," Cordelia repeated. "We called no names tonight." The townspeople quietly advanced toward the northern room, where the mirror was kept, the forbidden object not to be touched even during their silent ceremonies. The door was not locked, but its hinges creaked as if they hadn't been opened in a long time, though everyone knew the Whitlock sisters entered it once a week on the night of the crescent moon. The room was dark, but not entirely, for there was a very faint, thin light emanating from the large mirror's surface, though there was no fire, no lamp. And in the very center of the glass, they saw it a handprint, a single one, pressed deep, every knuckle distinct. But something made the entire room turn cold. The handprint wasn't pressed from the outside onto the mirror's surface. It was pressed from within, and its size was strangely wrong. Too large for a child's, too small for an adult's, like the hand of a being stretched while it was still forming. No one said anything more. No one knocked on the mirror. No one questioned the 3 sisters. They just backed away, one person clutching their chest, hearing their own heartbeat very clearly, but unsure if it was their own or something beating softly from behind the glass. The town council met in secret as the first frost touched the chapel roof. 4 men and 2 widows huddled in the stone cellar, surrounded by a list written in a trembling hand, the paper yellowed to the color of ash. The names of those who had given birth to children who did not cry. The names of those who saw light coming from a place with no windows. The names of those who stood before a mirror and saw no face. Every list ended in one place: Harrington Manor, the Whitlock family. The pastor who had blessed them 5 Christmases before now refused to say the name of that house aloud. God has turned his back. He whispered, his eyes fixed on a small crack in the stone floor, as if afraid it would breathe again. No one voted. No one argued. 3 would be sent, 1 for each room containing a sealed object. They would bring gifts of thanks, tallow candles, elderflowers, and clean sheep's wool. Not to befriend them, but to see if anyone was still on the other side of the mirror. Only 2 returned. The third, Joel Minton, a tanner, was last seen entering through the moss-covered stone gate at twilight. He carried a carefully wrapped cloth bag that had never been opened. 3 days later, the bag was found under the east porch. The flowers were not crushed. The wool was not wet. But Joel's boots stood upright on the stone step, as if he himself had slipped his feet into them and dissolved. Rain had fallen all night, but the step was bone dry. No one asked anything. No one knocked on Harrington's door again. Only a child recounted at night, if you stared long enough at the mirror room of the mansion, you would see a man with no eyes but with 3 shadows. By the end of that year, children stopped being born. No cries, no labor pains. Couples began sleeping in separate rooms, not because of discord, but for fear of giving birth to something not quite human at the hands of the 3 Whitlock sisters. The fields around Harrington Manor were abandoned, not because the soil was barren or the weather was bad, but because no one dared to plant anything where the shadow of that building might reach. The Whitlock mansion grew quieter. No more light from the northern window. The smoke from the main chimney thinned, but no one thought they had left. Only that they had gone deeper into the house itself. Some rumored that the 3 Whitlock sisters now lived in the cellar, sleeping on beds lined with black swan feathers, where the walls were covered with small mirrors, all veiled in cloth. All breathing. Others said they were just waiting for a name, the right name, which when spoken aloud would unlock something that should never have been called back. Then one night a stranger on horseback appeared from the west, dragging red dust from 3 counties beyond the mountain range. He carried a letter sealed with wax and a cross carved from charred yew wood, so black it couldn't be burned again. When he reached the Harrington hillside, his horse balked its eyes, streaked with red, spitting bloody foam before turning and bolting. The man continued alone, walking towards the rusty iron gate, where the light from within the mansion flickered like a pulse. The next morning the sun rose as red as a heated blade. The man, the letter, and the cross were never seen again. But that night the cloth covering the large mirror in the northern corridor was gone. Early 1844, a drought crept in from the south, smoldering like a persistent fever, so dry it cracked tree bark and bleached bones in the fields. The wells ran dry without warning, the earth splitting open like an unstitched wound. Frogs disappeared. The rain stopped calling its own name. But on the slope above Dogwood Parish, the garden of Harrington Manor flourished unnaturally. Not just alive, but living out of season, out of rhythm, out of nature itself. The grass grew so thick it dislodged the flagstones. Pale white roots pierced through the iron fence, creeping like pallid fingers. Bruise-colored flowers grew in spirals, twisting around the stems, as if strangling each other, and the fruit dripped a thick, syrupy liquid, a dark golden black, that stained the stone like diluted blood. No one planted that garden, and no one dared to cut it down. When a schoolboy, the churchwarden's son, wandered too close, mesmerized by the sweet yet cloying scent, like rotting meat, he returned with both palms blistered red, as if burned from the inside, and a fragment of a human tooth embedded in his ankle. The boy said in a feverish delirium, "They breathe, they move. They knew I was there. There are eyes in the grass and mouths in the walls." The doctor attributed it to sunstroke, but his mother didn't believe it. She left town just a week later, immediately after waking in the middle of the night, to find her front door nailed shut from the outside and the window curtains twisted into knots that spelled out her son's name in fabric pulled as straight as a stitch. That same season, a midwife from Clark Hollow, a land steeped in fog and mourning, arrived in Dogwood unannounced. She asked specifically about Harrington Manor, and the mere mention of that name caused the air in the inn to drop by 3 degrees. No one in town dared to speak the names of the 3 Whitlock sisters aloud anymore, not since the hilltop had fallen as silent as a grave, and the mirror in the main hall was rumored to be breathing. The strange woman wore a dark yellow bonnet, her hands clutching an old copper basin tied with twine, insisting she had received a letter summoning her to assist with a difficult birth. But no letter was found. None had been sent. No one admitted to seeing anyone write one. Nevertheless, she continued on walking up the path to the hill, as if drawn by something more ancient than an invitation, something that did not use ink and paper. 2 days passed. No one saw her return. On the morning of the 3rd day, the pastor's hound was found curled up on the chapel steps, foaming at the mouth, its body bleeding. Its fur was singed, leaving imprints in the shape of fingers. The copper basin was discovered at the bottom of a dry creek bed, dented and darkened as if heated from within. The midwife had vanished completely, but that night some who lived near the hill swore they heard singing from Harrington, 3 female voices harmonizing with a 4th thinner, higher and not entirely human. It was Maeve Whitlock who first began to appear alone. Still the youngest, still the one who walked a step behind her 2 sisters. That morning she descended the hill, passing through a fog as thick as animal hide, her apron stained with something between rust and dried wine. Her eyes were sunken, her irises cloudy without lashes, as if they had once been sewn shut then unstitched. She stood before the post office, staring at the flagpole until the sun had fully risen, and when the shopkeeper was about to offer a greeting, she merely muttered a single word, "Count." Then she turned and walked away. No one dared to follow. That same day, 3 carpenters discovered a row of hand-carved symbols under the schoolhouse floorboards, repeating over and over a concentric circle around a crude eye. The school teacher insisted she had never seen them before and left town without her pay the following week. Her replacement lasted only 18 days before fleeing in the night, terrified, screaming. The chalk on the board writes names by itself of children who haven't been born. She said at that moment she had seen Maeve standing at the edge of the forest, holding a red thread, her eyes fixed on the mirror still hanging in the mansion. Then came Cordelia Whitlock, the silent eldest sister, walking barefoot into the blacksmith's yard while it was still dark. She did not ask for fire, not for water, not for silver. She only said, "I need nails," not coffin nails, not horseshoes, but a very specific number, 41. When asked why, she replied flatly without looking at anyone, "One for each breath it was not allowed to take." The blacksmith, a man who believed more in God than in ghosts, still gave her the nails without taking a penny. But that night he could not sleep. In the middle of the night he shot up, screaming, his fingernails tearing at his shirt, his mouth howling, "Something is beating inside my bones." 3 days later he died, no wounds, no illness, just a heart that stopped in a still warm chest. His wife later confessed while making the bed she found 41 nails under the pillow, arranged in a circle like a mirror. The doctor called it post-traumatic stress. The priest called it God's judgment. But those who had heard Cordelia's voice speaking to the mirror in the night knew it was not a punishment. It was a promise being repaid. That winter the silence spread faster than the frost. Letters stopped arriving. The roads disappeared under snow, though no one remembered it ever snowing. The chapel bell, which had been broken for years, began to toll again every morning at 3, a single chime, deep hollow, like the last breath of a dying creature. Livestock were born deformed. Milk soured before it was even milked. But the 3 Whitlock sisters appeared more frequently than ever, always in a single file, not speaking, each carrying a jar of white wax as cold as bone and bundles of coarse cloth sewn with symbols no one had ever deciphered. A traveling priest, brave and arrogant, once tried to intervene. He climbed the slope of Harrington with a silver cross in an old scripture. He never returned. Only his boots were found 3 days later at the edge of the woods, and a torn page from his journal tucked inside a cracked wooden cross. On it, only 5 words scrawled in a trembling hand. "They are not just midwives." The page was sealed with a red, sticky, and foul-smelling substance, later confirmed to be human umbilical cord blood. At the spring thaw of 1845, a new sound began to echo from Harrington. Not a wolf's howl, not the wind tearing at branches, but a deep, steady hum like a voice from a sewn-shut throat still trying to sing. It began after the second bell at 3 in the morning and ended precisely before dawn. Those who heard it said it pulled something out of them, not blood but memory bone marrow the first breath. One man, driven by curiosity, approached the hillside, stuffing cotton in his ears, nailing a cross to his chest. He was found hours later in his cow shed, naked from the waist down, his hands clasped as if in prayer, his mouth stuffed with dried lavender. He lived for 3 more days, repeating only 3 phrases to his distraught wife: the mirror, the soul, the 3 sisters. When he died, all the candles in town flickered once, then burned with a blue flame, until their wicks vanished in silence. That spring, a new family arrived, unaware of Dogwood's silent decay. They were the Whiteleys merchants from the east who set up camp in an abandoned parsonage near the black rye fields. They hoped to put down roots. They reopened the school, invited neighbors for dinner. In their second week, their eldest daughter, Miriam, found a parcel wrapped in oilcloth under her bed. Inside was a braid of white hair tied with a milkweed vine and a piece of paper with shaky handwriting. The first breath must not be wasted. The mother burned the braid in the kitchen stove. That night, the stove exploded without a fire. Only thick smoke, smelling sweet and salty like spoiled milk, spreading across the walls in the shape of 3 open hands. The next morning, Miriam was gone. Her boots were placed neatly on the windowsill, their laces soaked in honey. The Whiteleys asked everywhere. No one helped. No one spoke the sisters' names. Miriam was no longer there. Only the mirror hanging in Harrington remained silent, but its glass now showed a new image, a little girl with a white braid blurred, as if being incompletely sewn into another world. That same day, it did not rain, but the roof tiles of the Whiteleys' house were soaked. Water seeped from the inside out, each drop as cold as a reversing bloodstream. The father, Jonathan, climbed onto the roof to check and found a small piece of mirror in the middle of it. It reflected nothing, just a flat surface stained with dried blood in the shape of 3 letters EW. He tried to remove it, but as his fingertips touched the edge, a thin cut sliced through his skin like a razor-sharp stitch. He fell from the roof, and when he woke up, he began to forget. Not just Miriam, but his son, the stove, his own name. He wandered the town like a sleepwalker, constantly repeating, "The 273rd braid. The pillow is still warm. The thread hasn't been fully pulled." The people began to count. Another child in the area, the salt seller's youngest son, began to draw with dry salt on his bedroom window. No one taught him how, nor had anyone ever seen the bizarre shape he drew: a pillow, but not the kind for sleeping. Rather something that looked like a knot of braided entrails, swollen and sagging, as if holding something that did not want to be held. That pillow, according to the boy, was stuffed with wax powder mixed with infant hair and curdled milk. In its center was a needle hole, with no needle, just a small empty hollow, like a breathing pore. And around it were spiral stitches drawn with a trembling hand, as if each thread was weaving itself into the child's hand as he slept. He whispered in the night, "That's where they keep the souls before they can fly away. They have to wait for the thread to be long enough. They have to wait for the right mirror beat." The other children initially laughed at him, but then they began to dream of the same object, a pillow emitting a cold smoke, lying in the middle of a windowless room, and around it the slow, steady, unhurried sound of a needle-piercing skin. They began to avoid mirrors, even puddles of water, because an old woman, one who had lived long enough to remember the last time anyone escaped the Whitlock mansion, had told them, "I saw the mirror move, not reflecting, but breathing. It rose, then contracted, like a reverse lung, but instead of inhaling air, it inhales memories." She said that when the mirror inhaled, the smallest things left you first. Your name, the smell of your kitchen, the lullaby you sang to your child, then deeper things, the reason you were born, why you had children, why you feared the mirror. Someone once entered Harrington Manor just to ask for some cough medicine for a child. When she returned, she didn't know the way home, not because she was lost, but because the concept of home had been sucked from her mind. "That mirror isn't for looking," the old woman whispered, her eyes now blind, but her hands still fumbling as if searching for the glass surface. It is the stitch between two worlds, and every soul sewn into it will twitch whenever someone remembers its name. That night, the salt cellar's window cracked in a spiral pattern. In his son's room on the pillow was a bone needle, its eye threaded with a red thread that was still warm. From that night on, the children in the area began to whisper in their sleep. Not in their own words, but in old, strange, cramped syllables, like a thread pulled taut through their throats. Sentences no one understood. But when one mother tried to write down what her daughter uttered in the middle of the night, the letters began to twist into arcs that matched the stitch patterns on the inside of the Whitlock mirror. A tailor, old and blind, living on the edge of Dogwood Parish, was asked to interpret. He touched the paper, held his breath for a second, then spoke softly as if reading instructions. The needle must follow the first bloodline. Thread from the navel, pull through the nape, and do not let go when the child cries. The woman screamed. That was how her child had been born, a delivery performed by Maeve Whitlock herself on a snowy night when no one remembered inviting them. At this point, some began to whisper that not all the children born belonged to this world, that some were mirror spirits, creatures not quite alive but not quite dead either. They were the stitches, the connections between the retained souls and the mirror that was waiting to be completely closed. A man who had survived the loss of his newborn son said that the night his son died, he saw his face, no longer on his body but reflected in the mirror in the great hall of the Whitlock house, being embroidered with light. A few days after the salt seller's son left the drawing of the pillow with the needle hole, the salt in his house began to weep. Not melting, just weeping like sweat from stone, like living ash. It poured from the cracks of cupboards, filled the legs of tables, covered the wooden floor with a fine layer like a second skin, and within it, hidden, were fine strands of hair, so pale they could only be seen when tilting one's head under candlelight. He tried to sweep it away, but every morning he found the salt covering everything again, this time in a circle with his son's sleeping spot at the center. The boy no longer spoke, just placed a finger on his lips whenever an adult asked. Not to ask for silence, but as if he were listening. Elsewhere in the village, the bone needle disappeared from the child's pillow. 3 days later, a mother found it between her daughter's fingers, piercing a small half-finished piece of cloth on which was embroidered in red thread, "Not blood, it's a joint." The girl had never learned to embroider, nor could she read. But when the needle was taken from her, she shrieked as if being skinned alive, then fainted with her hand reaching toward the sun, her index finger stiff as a needle. That night, the Harrington mirror breathed again. Those who lived near the hillside where the mansion stood now, only referred to vaguely as that place, heard a faint cracking sound from the glass, like ice melting into flesh. Not breaking, but expanding, widening. The glass surface pulsed, with a rhythm. A young girl who lived nearby recounted, "I saw the moonlight reflected in the mirror, but the moon had set long ago that night. So where did that light come from?" The next day, an old woman gathering firewood at the edge of the forest discovered a lock of white hair tied with black thread hanging from a branch like a heavy fruit. Beneath it was a depression in the earth, oval shape, sunken just right for a newborn baby to lie in curled up. In the following days, the children in the area began to have the same dream. They told in voices that did not seem to be their own of a room filled only with wind, its walls covered in white curtains, and in the middle of the floor was a pillow sewn by hand with a bone needle stuck upright in it. On the ceiling, it was not a lamp, but a round mirror spinning slowly like an old record, emitting a rustling sound in a language that could not be written down. A little girl whispered in class, "We lie on the pillow." Then she starts to embroider, but not with thread, but with us. The adults initially thought it was just a fever, a wave of nightmares spreading through sleep, until one father woke up in the middle of the night to find his child lying on his back on the floor, eyes open, mouth sealed, and surrounded by a chain of stitches made with blackboard chalk, each stroke broken like a stitch completing a form. The boy survived, but from then on he had no reflection in the mirror. At the threshold of June, a series of strange objects began to appear around Dogwood Parish. Not on the streets, but on rooftops, baby blankets, infant undershirts, woolen socks, all brand new, never used, but covered in a thin layer of soot and smelling of cold, curdled milk. An old glass jar was placed on the steps of the former pastor's house. Inside was amniotic fluid, still warm, and at the bottom a wax fetus, eyeless but bearing a complete smile. A widow who had once been a nurse trembled when she saw it, managing only to say, "That smile is what you see in the mirror every time someone dies without seeing their loved ones a final time." And then on a morning with no birdsong, the Whitlock mirror shed a layer of mist. But this time it did not dissipate. It clung like a second skin, covering the glass and beginning to move from within, not a reflection, but as if someone were turning over, like a fetus in a dark womb. That very night, a sound came from Harrington Manor for the first time in years. Click, 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 like a needle-piercing pigskin, repetitive, rhythmic, intentional. The next morning on the threshold of the church, no longer an altar, no longer a pastor, was a piece of linen, brand new, so white it was chilling, and on it, embroidered in dark red thread, was a line of text, 368. No one understood. But that night, the mirror in the Whitlock house pulsed again, and someone in town forgot their child's name. It seemed that something or someone was restitching the world in a strange, older, deeper order than human memory. Not a dream, not a curse, but the meticulous tailoring of an invisible hand sewing up the blank spaces in history with threads of hair and needles of bone. A few people sensed it, then forgot. But one man did not forget. Or if he did, he had learned how to sew back what was taken. They called him Silas Greaves, an old bookbinder who lived on the edge of Dogwood, where no other houses were built, only wild apple trees growing near stone graves, and a stagecoach stop no one visited anymore. Silas was a man no one clearly remembered arriving. No papers, no relatives. Only the notebooks he sewed himself with thread pulled from old coats. People said he had lived there since before the three Whitlock sisters began to be called the midwives. He did not socialize, only traded books for candles, paper for dye. But after the night 368 appeared, he began to walk around town, not speaking, just taking notes. From the inn's window, people saw him sketching the pillow that the salt seller's son had drawn from memory, without needing a model. He sewed it onto the inside of his coat. An antique dealer recounted that Silas had quietly traded for 3 old combs and a broken hand mirror. When asked what he would do with them, he replied softly, "They only reflect a part, but the needle's path is always straight." On a foggy afternoon, Silas went to the old church, now just a rotting wooden frame and a cracked stone foundation. He sat on a broken windowsill, opened a half-sewn notebook, and began to copy the names of the unborn children. No one told him to, but his hand just kept writing. Bethel, Ulter, Rosund, Mireille, hundreds of names, each connected by a red thread circle like a blood vessel, piercing through the paper. No ink, only stitches. That night, a wind blew backwards into town, and all the oil lamps in Dogwood simultaneously tilted their flames towards Harrington Manor. Silas was the only one who kept the candle on his desk burning steady. He began to gather the abandoned objects, children's shoes, swaddling cloths, half-embroidered pillows. They all had one thing in common. Somewhere on the fabric there was the mark of a needle stopped mid-stitch, an incomplete fold, as if the sewer had been called away before they could complete the final stitch. He carefully undid them, removing each stitch, and recorded their direction. He recorded how the threads twisted together, forming a shape not meant to hold, but to pull. One night he found a bone needle placed before his door. No wrapping, no paper, just a single white hair tied around the needle's shaft in a knot as delicate as milk bone. Silas was not afraid. He placed the needle in the middle of his notebook, sewed it into the book's spine, and whispered, "I know you don't use thread. You use time." That night, the Harrington mirror stopped breathing, but there was a tapping, very light, like from inside a mother's womb. Silas was not a man who believed in the supernatural, but he believed in repetition. And things that repeat, if sewn together in the right order, eventually reveal the shape of a story. He had notebooks that no one remembered, giving him old birth and death records, smeared ink, darkened paper, traces of dried blood. There was one volume filled only with the names of infants, most of whom were never recorded in any baptismal register. There was another smaller one listing only dates and thread colors, red-brown, sometimes black. But red was the most frequent, and each red line was accompanied by a single drawing, a curved needle piercing through an empty circle. Silas began to cut out the pieces, to paste them together, to place them side by side. The names of the missing children, not by family, but by chronological order, moon cycles in each dry season. And in each of these seasons, he began to see a pattern. After every 25 children, a sign would appear in public, a piece of cloth, an empty cradle, a wax-sealed lock of hair, a line of blood-stitched letters, or sometimes a strange reflection in a window where no one was standing. Then one night he took out a magnifying glass to examine a piece of red thread cut from the shroud of an infant abandoned at the chapel door years ago. That thread was no ordinary thread. It was hair braided together, and inside it hidden was something smaller, a wax core often used in sewing shrouds. Silas sat up all night. The oil lamp burned down to its wick. He turned back to the faded cover book, the handwritten volume in an ink of unknown origin. In it was a note, a mix of Latin and a language he had never learned. The initial pain pulled through the eye of the needle. The blood of a child is the guide. Each soul must be anchored with a stitch not allowed to escape between the layers of the mirror. Silas stopped. Mirror, stitch, soul. And then he remembered something everyone else had forgotten. There was a mirror hanging in Harrington Manor, where the three reclusive Whitlock sisters lived never apart. The mirror was carved with a bronze border, its frame twisting like the spine of a creature, and its surface did not reflect straight, but rippled like a pond that had been breathed upon. He had seen it, as a child, when he had wandered into some funeral prayer in the woods. No one remembered who had died, but the mirror did. Silas knew he had looked into it, and after that he began to forget his mother's name. He started to mark it all down again. Each red thread a soul, each birthing season a cycle. And when he counted to the most recent mark, the number was 482. Silas no longer slept. From the day he saw the number 482, something within him had shifted, not his body, but his concept of time. Each toll of the nightly bell struck like a new stitch in the cloth that someone or something was completing. One night while flipping through a ledger, a small piece of paper fell out. No words, just a circle drawn in dried ink, and a strange symbol in the middle. 3 threads twisted together, passing through a vertical needle's eye. Around the circle's edge were tiny incised marks like fish scales or like a child's fingerprints. Silas realized this was the symbol of the ritual, and then he remembered a book without a cover, tucked between 2 pieces of old leather, with no author's name, only a title in silver ink, The Red Thread of the World Beneath the Skin. Intro. The first page had no introduction, only a sentence. That which is dead still waits to be sown. The book described an ancient ritual performed only by hands that have cut through life, 3 midwives or 3 women who could hold life and not grant it. The ritual required a medium, a blood mirror, made from the blood of the first stillborn soul, and mercury gathered from a place with no moonlight. That mirror did not reflect it identified. And during each birth, if the child's soul had not yet taken root in the world, it would be drawn into the mirror like an unknotted thread. Each soul was sewn back with a red stitch, usually hair wax blood or a final breath. 500 souls. That was the complete number, not random, but the number of needle eyes required to open the stitch between the living and the dead, wide enough for a soul from below to return. But this was the part that sent a chill down Silas's spine. It wasn't just about resurrecting someone. The last page, the ink faded, but he could still read it. Each child's soul is not brought back, but pieced together into a single body. Not resurrection, but reweaving. Their parents will not return as they were. They will return sewn from the cries and blood of others. Silas backed away from the table. The room grew cold. The wind did not blow, but his chest heaved as if someone else were breathing for him. He understood. The 3 Whitlock sisters never apart, not because of kinship, but because they were 3 needles in a ritual that required 3 sewing hands. And the mirror in Harrington was the final eye of the needle. Only 18 more souls. Then the thing that lay beneath the floorboards of the mansion, the thing that had breathed, that had swelled, would be completely sewn. Silas exhaled his hand, gripping the edge of the book. It was not a simple ritual. It was a reverse gestation, a being that had never been born. Not of this world. A resurrection not for the dead, but for something that had never been born, never had form, just a massive delusion woven from 500 interrupted first breaths, each needle piercing the nape, each dream buried alive. The mirror, if it was the final eye of the needle, only needed those 3 needles to reflect, and everything would be reversed. There was only one way to make all 3 Whitlock sisters simultaneously look at themselves, something they always avoided, not out of fear, but because if they saw the incorrectly sewn structure of their own souls would tear itself apart from within, and the ritual's reverse stitch would be broken. Silas knew he needed to understand more. Not just the ritual, but the thing waiting to be born. He returned to the old notes, the diaries of the vanished priest, and the diagrams carved beneath the layers of dust in the chapel. Under the candlelight, through a trembling magnifying glass, a phrase kept repeating, interspersed with sewing symbols and anatomical diagrams. Not a person, not a memory, but the final form of grief that was never buried. Another passage drawn in ink as red as an umbilical cord. The souls of children are easily torn fabric, but when enough are sewn, they form a complete skin. Beneath Harrington, it is convulsing, learning to cry, learning to open its eyes. Silas stood silently before the map of the floorboards he had pieced together from torn papers. The focal point in the center of the great hall where the mirror hung was a circled area. The lines depicted wooden planks that were slightly swollen, not from rot, but because something was pushing up from below. When he traced the records of the old midwives, those who had disappeared, who had left behind scorched copper basins and patched up prayers, one thing became clear. The thing beneath was not the parents of the 3 Whitlock sisters, not a ghost, but a composite stitched together from all the souls ever pulled from their bodies in the first moments of life. They had never lived fully. They had never had names. And now they were being sewn together into a single entity, not of flesh, but of breath, of swallowed cries in the cold between unwarmed blankets. A giant child, boneless, faceless. Just a lumpy, moving mass, always hungry, always remembering each time it was deprived of the chance to live. Silas imagined if the ritual were completed, if the 500th soul were sewn into the final layer of fabric, that thing would burst from the floorboards like a mature chrysalis. It would need no mother, for the 3 Whitlock sisters were the sewing hands sufficient to deliver it. And when it opened its eyes, its first gaze not towards the light, but towards the regrets of this world, all of Dogwood would be its first cradle, and also its first grave. He collapsed, feeling as if something were draining his own marrow through the hand holding the pen. The scraps of letters, prayers, and midwives' diaries from generations past now fit together like silent stitches. And the picture that emerged was no longer a family tragedy. It was an ancient plan. The 3 Whitlock sisters were not grieving. They were not mourning. They were not trying to call their parents back from the dead. They were nurturing an entity created from abandoned sorrow, from the first scream that never sounded, from the fetal heartbeat that stopped midway from the souls who had just opened their eyes, only to be herded into a mirror, sewn silent. And the thing beneath the floor of Harrington, the thing that was swelling each night, was not a relative, but the final crystallization of an entire town's sin. An entity that lived on denial, on souls no one bothered to name, and it didn't need anyone to resurrect it. It only needed to be born. Silas shuddered. The curse was not in death, but in the fact that the 3 sisters had found a way to reverse nature, to pull what had never lived, to create a child of oblivion. They never intended to bring their parents back. They intended to bring this thing into the world. And when it was born, not just Dogwood, but everything that had ever been reflected in a mirror would no longer be itself. Silas knelt before his desk. His mind spun as if he himself were being sewn into a circle with no escape. No ritual is perfect. No prayer is strong enough to break something that has been fed on the souls of children for over a century. But in a footnote in dried ink, he found a faint line written over a newborn's handprint. If all 3 sewing hands are reflected at once, the mirror will reverse the needle's direction. Just reverse the stitch. The thread cannot be unraveled. The children will not return, but the thread will no longer connect to the next one's neck. Silas closed his eyes. If only he had read it sooner. If only the solution had come when the number was not yet 472. But there were no more if-onlys. There was only one choice to sew the ritual in reverse. Not to save, but to end. To end a blood-soaked thread. To end the cries that were never heard. To end the mirror's inhalation of another soul. And he would do it. Not to get anything back, but so that no one else would have anything more taken. That evening, as the fog from the foothills began to creep up the chapel's stone steps, Silas Greaves left his old bookbinder's hut. No one saw him carry anything other than a thick coat with missing buttons and a candle made of black wax that he had kept from a funeral with no relatives. He walked towards Harrington. No one saw him pass the stagecoach stop. No one saw him cross the field. Only a little girl recounted seeing a figure standing for a long time under the dry apple tree in front of the Whitlock mansion, a hand holding a black silk hat as if to block the wind, though there was no wind that night. Then, nothing more. No thunder, no tremors, no brilliant light from the hill. Just this: the next morning, Harrington still stood quieter, darker, as if it had closed its own eyelids. But when the blacksmith passed by at noon, he said the front door was open, just a crack enough for a shadow to slip through. No one saw Silas from that night on, nor did anyone see Cordelia Maeve or Eleanor Whitlock again. The 3 black dresses once seen fluttering across the meadows were also gone. No blood, no ash, no screams. Only a quiet absence, like when the last letters stop arriving. The mirror in the great hall was said to have grown dim, not broken, just dim, as if someone had breathed on its surface from the other side. No one knows what happened in that mansion that night, but from that day on, no more children disappeared. No more 3 a.m. bell. No more warm porridge in an empty cradle. No more cradles. No more mirrors. Only 3 empty chairs at a long wooden table covered in a fine layer of dust, never before seen in Harrington, and a broken red thread lying silently in the wax palm of a nameless mannequin. No one dared to go near the house again. The house still stands there on the edge of the faded hillside as if waiting. No one saw the 3 Whitlock sisters again, nor did anyone mention Silas Greaves, the old bookbinder, who disappeared on the night the wind changed direction, the last to cross a threshold from which he never returned. People say the mirror still hangs in the great hall. Its glass no longer reflects a human figure, just a deep, dark void so silent that you can hear the sound of a needle sewing through flesh if you stand close. And if you listen long enough, really long enough, you might hear something fragmented, repetitive, like 3 female voices whispering on a breath. Was the ritual broken? No one knows for sure. All that is known is this: no more children disappeared. No more chapel bell at 3 in the morning. No more warm porridge in an empty cradle. But no one dared to bring their children near the hill either. And every time the wax season comes, when the wind blows backwards and the datura flowers bloom late, a scent of rust mixed with spoiled milk creeps through the fog, making young mothers grip their children's hands a little tighter. Not because they fear something will come, but because they aren't sure it has ever left.